"You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife isn't." My son said it loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. The clatter of silverware paused. Conversations around us dimmed into an uncomfortable hum. I remember the way the ice shifted in my water glass when my hand trembled slightly against it. Just once. Then I steadied myself. We were sitting at a corner table in a steakhouse downtown. The kind of place where businessmen close deals over medium-rare ribeyes and $18 glasses of Cabernet. My son, Daniel, had chosen it. He said we needed to talk like adults. Across from him sat Lila, my ex-husband's new wife. 28 years old. Perfect hair. Perfect teeth. The kind of polished smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She didn't speak when Daniel said those words. She just adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist and looked at her wine. "You've done nothing with your life," Daniel continued, his jaw tight. "Dad built something. Lila supports him. She adds value. What do you add? What do you add?" I looked at my son, the boy I once held against my chest at 2 a.m. when he had nightmares about thunderstorms. The boy whose science fair projects I stayed up all night helping him finish because his father was too busy building the future. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't cry. I just said, very quietly, "I see. If you're here with me, stay until the end of my story. And tell me the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this moment travels, because what happened next didn't just change my life. It changed his." The waiter approached, uncertain. "Is everything all right here?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "We're fine." I smiled politely at the young man. "Yes, everything's fine." Everything was not fine. But humiliation has a way of sharpening your senses. I noticed things I might have missed before. The way Daniel leaned slightly toward Lila when he spoke. The way he avoided my eyes as if looking at me required too much effort. The way Lila's hand rested lightly on his arm, claiming territory that used to be mine as a mother. "You've always depended on Dad," Daniel went on. "After the divorce, you just stayed small. Lila encouraged him to expand the business. She's the reason he's where he is now." Oh, so that was it. This wasn't just about me. It was about loyalty, alignment, sides. I took a sip of water. It tasted metallic. "Daniel," I said gently, "I worked 2 jobs when your father started that company in our garage." He shrugged. "That was decades ago. Things change. Decades ago. As if time erases sacrifice. As if motherhood expires." The restaurant noise resumed around us, but our table felt sealed in glass. I could feel people pretending not to stare. I could feel Lila's satisfaction, subtle, controlled, but present. "You need to stop clinging to the past," Daniel said. "Dad's happy now. And honestly, he deserves someone who lifts him up, not someone who drags him down." "Drags him down." I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. That caught him off guard. Lila blinked. Daniel frowned slightly, as if he'd prepared for tears, anger, maybe even a scene. Not agreement. "I don't want to argue," I continued calmly. "You invited me to lunch. I assumed it was to spend time together." He shifted in his seat. "It is," he muttered. "But you need to hear the truth." The truth. The word echoed strangely in my chest. I reached for my purse. "I have," I said. Lila finally spoke, her voice soft, rehearsed. "We just think it would be healthier if you adjusted your expectations. Dad's life has evolved." Evolved. Like I was some outdated model. I stood slowly. My knees ached. Arthritis has a way of reminding you of your age at inconvenient moments, but I refused to let it show. "I'm glad your father is happy," I said. "And I'm glad you're both confident in your place beside him." Daniel's expression hardened. "So you're not even going to fight for your dignity?" I looked at him fully then. Dignity doesn't require shouting. Silence. For the first time, he looked uncertain. I left enough cash on the table to cover my untouched meal and walked toward the exit. Each step felt deliberate, measured, controlled. No one stopped me. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt harsh against my face. Traffic moved along the avenue as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. A bus roared past. A couple laughed as they crossed the street. The world continues, even when your own child erases you in public. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than 67. Not fragile, just recalibrating. Worthless. The word didn't sting the way he probably intended. It clarified. You see, Daniel believed something that afternoon. He believed his father owned everything. He believed Lila was the reason for the company's expansion. He believed I had stayed small. What he didn't know, what neither of them understood, was that some foundations are invisible, and some signatures matter more than applause. I drove home slowly, past the subdivision where Daniel learned to ride his bike, past the elementary school where I volunteered every Thursday for 8 years, past the small brick church where we once sat together as a family. Memory is a stubborn thing. When I reached my house, the quiet inside didn't feel empty. It felt steady. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stood still for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. "You're worthless." I repeated it once, softly. Then I walked upstairs to my office. And I opened the locked drawer. A week. That's all it took. The house felt different after the divorce. Not emptier. Just rearranged. When Richard moved out 3 years ago, he didn't take much. A few tailored suits. His golf clubs. The framed photo from our 20th anniversary. The one where I was laughing and he was looking at the camera instead of me. He left the heavy oak dining table. The leather armchair. The garage workshop where he started the company everyone now praises him for. He left the foundation. I stayed. The first few months after the divorce, Daniel still came by every Sunday. He would sit at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone while I cooked pot roast or grilled salmon. He used to tell me about work, about small frustrations, about how tired he was. But slowly, the conversation shifted. It became Dad and Lila are hosting something. Dad's traveling again. Lila thinks the brand needs a fresher image. Lila thinks. Lila suggests. Lila advised. I noticed how often her name appeared where mine once did. At first, I told myself this was natural. A new marriage. A honeymoon phase. Adjustments. I am not a dramatic woman. I have lived long enough to know that relationships change shape. Children grow. Parents become background figures. But there is a difference between growing up and pulling away. One Sunday, Daniel walked into my kitchen wearing a watch I'd never seen before. Sleek. Expensive. Dad gave it to me, he said casually, celebrating the new expansion. I nodded and sliced carrots for the stew. That's nice, I said. He's doing really well, Daniel added. Lila pushed him to scale nationally. She says he was thinking too small before. Too small. The phrase landed somewhere quiet inside me. For 29 years of marriage, I handled payroll when we couldn't afford an accountant. I answered customer emails at midnight. I packed product boxes in the garage while Daniel did homework at the folding table beside me. Small. The company had started with my credit score, my signature on the initial business loan, my willingness to go back to work full-time when cash flow dipped. But I didn't correct him. Correction sounds defensive. Defensive sounds bitter. Instead, I stirred the pot and asked if he wanted more bread. After the divorce, Richard's lifestyle became visible. Photos online, charity galas, rooftop parties, Lila in designer gowns, smiling beside him as if she had always been there. Daniel began attending those events. He stopped staying long at my house. "Mom, you should get out more," he said once, glancing around my living room. "You're kind of stuck." Stuck. In the house I paid off. In the kitchen where I raised him. In the life I built. I didn't argue. I simply watched. There were other small things. He stopped calling me Mom in text messages. It became hey, or nothing at all. He once corrected me when I referred to the business as ours. "It's Dad's company," he said firmly. I remember looking at him across the table that day. "I know," I replied. Because technically, on paper, after the divorce settlement, it was structured differently. That had been my decision. At the time, I believed it would make things easier. Cleaner. Less conflict. I didn't want to fight over assets. I didn't want Daniel choosing sides in courtrooms. So I made concessions. Quiet ones. What Daniel never understood was that ownership is rarely as simple as it looks from the outside. The afternoon at the steakhouse wasn't the first time he'd diminished me. It was just the first time he did it loudly. Public humiliation has a way of stripping illusion. After that lunch, I replayed conversations in my mind. The way Daniel's tone shifted whenever Lila was near. The subtle comparisons. Lila's so driven. Lila understands Dad. Lila has vision. Vision. I used to sit at the edge of our bed at night, while Richard sketched expansion plans on a yellow legal pad. I listened. I asked questions. I challenged projections that didn't add up. I was never the face of the company, but I was its spine, and Daniel had grown up watching that, which meant something else was happening now. Something beyond admiration. Influence. alignment, maybe even persuasion. I don't accuse lightly. I observe. And what I observed was this. The more Daniel immersed himself in his father's new world, the smaller I became in his narrative. It's easier to rewrite history than to acknowledge sacrifice. At night, after the steakhouse incident, I walked through my house slowly. The hallway walls still held Daniel's childhood photos, Little League trophies, a high school graduation picture, the day he left for college. I touched one frame gently. "You're worthless." He said it with conviction. Conviction doesn't appear overnight. It grows. It's fed. I turned off the hallway light and stood in the darkness for a moment. The divorce had divided property, but it had also divided perception. Richard had money. Lila had youth. Daniel had chosen proximity to power. And I had silence. But silence is not the same as weakness. By the time the week ended, I understood something clearly. They believed I had stayed small. They believed I no longer mattered to the structure they were building. And that belief, more than the insult itself, was the real mistake. It wasn't just the lunch. It was what happened after. Daniel didn't call for 3 days. That alone wouldn't have meant much. He's 34. He has his own life. But usually, after an argument, even a small one, he would send a short message. "Sorry about earlier." Or at least, "You okay?" This time, nothing. On the 4th day, I received an email. Not a call. Not a text. An email. Subject line: quick question about some documents. Documents. I opened it slowly. "Hey, Dad's restructuring some things with the company. Lila suggested we make sure all the older paperwork is aligned. Do you still have copies of the original incorporation agreements? Also, can you confirm what assets were fully transferred in the divorce?" No greeting. No warmth. Just logistics. I read it twice. Richard had never once handled paperwork without calling me first. Even after the divorce, if there was something administrative, he would at least inform me. This time, he hadn't. Lila suggested. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. 3 years ago, during the divorce, I agreed to a clean structure. On paper, Richard retained operational control of the company. I kept certain holdings separate: investments, a property share, and something else most people didn't pay attention to. Most people assume control equals ownership. It doesn't. But Daniel didn't know the details. And from the tone of his email, neither did Lila. I replied simply, "Yes. I have copies." "What?" His answer came faster than I expected. "Just making sure everything's clear. Dad's financial advisor thinks it's better if there aren't loose ends." Loose ends. That phrase again, as if I were an unfinished thread to be trimmed. Later that afternoon, I checked the shared online folder Richard and I once used for tax filings. There had been activity. New folders. New advisors added. Names I didn't recognize. Lila's last name appeared on several file updates. I closed my laptop without commenting. Observation first. Reaction later. The next sign came 2 days after that. Daniel stopped by unannounced. He hadn't done that in over a year. He stood in my doorway with forced casualness. "Hey, Mom." "Mom." The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. "I was in the area," he said. "Thought I'd swing by." I invited him in. He walked around the living room slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the built-in shelves, the hardwood floors, the antique clock Richard's father left us. "You ever think about downsizing?" he asked. I poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Not really. It's a lot of house for one person." "It's paid off," I replied. He nodded, but I could see calculation behind his expression. "Dad mentioned maybe consolidating assets," he continued. "Streamlining things. It might be easier for everyone long-term." Everyone. That word has always been dangerous. "Easier how?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "Just making sure everything's protected. In case something happens." In case something happens. I studied my son's face. He wasn't being cruel in that moment. He was being strategic. There's a difference. Cruelty is emotional. Strategy is taught. "Daniel," I said calmly, "are you worried about me?" He hesitated. "No. I just think Dad's planning ahead. And Lila's really good with financial planning." There it was again. "Lila." I handed him his coffee. "When your father started that business," I said, "did you know we almost lost this house?" He frowned slightly. "What?" "We mortgaged it twice in the first 5 years." He looked genuinely surprised. "Dad never mentioned that." I smiled faintly. He wouldn't. Silence stretched between us. He took a sip of coffee, avoiding my eyes. That was the moment I understood something clearly. They weren't just reorganizing paperwork. They were rewriting history. If Daniel believed the company was entirely his father's creation, if he believed Lila was the architect of its success, then it would make sense, in his mind, to protect it from me. From the outdated ex-wife. From the woman who had stayed small. Mom, he said cautiously, you don't need to be involved in all that anymore. You've done your part. Done my part. Like I was a retired employee. Not a co-founder. Not a financial backer. Not the one whose signature secured the first line of credit. I didn't argue. Arguing would confirm the narrative they were building, that I was clinging. Instead, I asked one simple question. Daniel, who told you I wasn't involved? He blinked. Well, I just assumed. Assumption. The most convenient tool in manipulation. He finished his coffee quickly after that. Said he had another meeting. Left with a polite hug that felt more like obligation than affection. When the door closed behind him, the house didn't feel rearranged anymore. It felt evaluated, measured, assessed. They were positioning pieces on a board, and they believed I wasn't playing. That evening, I opened the locked drawer in my office again. Inside were copies of agreements, amendments, and one document neither Daniel nor Lila had mentioned in their restructuring. A clause added quietly during the divorce settlement. One Richard had signed without fully understanding its long-term implications. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper. You're worthless. No, I was patient. And patience, at my age, is rarely accidental. By the end of that week, I didn't just see what they were doing. I saw what they were about to try. And that's when I decided I would stop observing and start preparing. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I sat at my desk with a banker's box pulled from the back of the closet. The cardboard was worn at the corners, edges softened by time. Inside were records. Not glamorous ones. Not award plaques or framed certificates. Receipts. Loan documents. Old bank statements. I lifted the first folder and smiled faintly at the date. Back when the company was nothing more than an idea and a folding table in our garage. Richard used to say he had a vision. And he did. I won't take that from him. He could see potential where others saw risk. But vision doesn't pay utility bills. I was the one who worked the extra shift at the pharmacy when cash flow dipped. I was the one who refinanced the house, twice, so payroll wouldn't bounce. I was the one who answered customer service calls while stirring spaghetti sauce with my free hand. Daniel was 8 years old the first time we almost lost everything. He doesn't remember that. He remembers his father working late. He doesn't remember me sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, calculator beside me, trying to stretch $312 across groceries, gas, and school supplies. Memory edits things, especially when success eventually arrives. I pulled out a yellowed copy of the original incorporation agreement. My signature was on page 3, not as a spouse, as a co-founder. We never advertised it publicly. It wasn't strategic at the time. Investors preferred a single face. Richard was charismatic. I was practical. So we agreed I would remain behind the curtain. It didn't bother me then. I believed in what we were building. Marriage, at least in my generation, wasn't about applause. It was about endurance. When Daniel was in high school, the business finally stabilized. We moved from the garage into a small warehouse. Richard hired his first employees. He started wearing tailored suits instead of clearance rack blazers. I remember the first year we showed a real profit. Richard brought home a bottle of champagne. We did it, he said. We. That word used to include me. Somewhere along the way, it stopped. I set the folder aside and opened another. Divorce settlement. 3 years ago. Clean. Polite. Controlled. People complimented us on how mature we handled it. No screaming matches. No courtroom drama. Just signatures. But maturity has layers. During mediation, Richard's attorney pushed for full operational control. He argued it would prevent confusion in leadership. I agreed. On one condition. At the time, Richard barely glanced at the clause. He was eager to finalize everything. Lila had already entered the picture, quietly at first, then more visibly. The clause was simple. If substantial restructuring, liquidation, or equity transfer occurred without my written consent, specific foundational shares would revert. Not to him. To me. It was framed as a stability measure. His attorney skimmed it. Richard trusted me enough not to question it. Trust is a powerful thing. So is oversight. I closed the folder slowly. Daniel didn't know about that clause. Why would he? In his mind, The divorce ended my relevance. In reality, it redefined it. I stood and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet. A porch light flickered across the way. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. You've done your part. Daniel's words echoed again. Done my part. As if motherhood and partnership were seasonal contracts. As if sacrifice expired. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt was something colder. Clarity. Over the years, I allowed Richard to be the public architect. I allowed Daniel to see his father as the builder. I allowed invisibility because it kept the family intact. But invisibility has consequences. If you remain quiet long enough, people start believing you contributed nothing. I sat back down at my desk and opened my laptop. I reviewed the recent activity logs again. New advisors. New structural proposals. Language about equity realignment. If Richard moved too aggressively, if Lila pushed for rapid changes, they might trigger the very clause they overlooked. They were planning. So was I? I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. Thomas Green. My attorney. Not Richard's. Mine. I didn't dial yet. Timing matters. The goal wasn't confrontation. It was positioning. Daniel believed I had stayed small. Lila believed I was outdated. Richard likely believed I would remain cooperative, no matter what direction he steered the company. They were adjusting the future based on that assumption. And assumptions, when incorrect, are expensive. I gathered the documents neatly and placed them back into the box. Before closing the lid, I paused and looked once more at the faded ink of my signature from decades ago. Not dramatic. Not flashy. Just steady. They thought the foundation belonged to someone else now. They thought history could be simplified. They thought I wouldn't notice. I turned off the desk lamp and let the room fall into darkness. A week ago, my son called me worthless in a crowded restaurant. Tonight, I understood something he didn't. Worthless things don't hold leverage. And I had more leverage than they realized. By the end of this week, I would decide exactly how much of it to use. Daniel called Friday morning. Not to apologize. Not to ask how I was. Dad wants to have a family meeting on Monday, he said. Just to clarify some financial transitions. It's nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic. That phrase usually means the opposite. Where? I asked. At the main office. Conference room. Lila will be there. And Dad's advisor. Of course she would be. I pictured the conference room, glass walls, polished table, framed magazine articles praising Richard's entrepreneurial vision. I had helped paint those first warehouse walls myself. What's the purpose of the meeting? I asked calmly. Just aligning expectations, Daniel replied. Making sure everyone understands the future structure. Everyone. I let a small silence stretch. Will there be documents? I asked. A pause on his end. Probably. I'll be there, I said. He hesitated. You don't have to come, Mom. It's mostly operational. I'll be there, I repeated. After we hung up, I didn't pace. I didn't panic. I called Thomas Green. He answered on the second ring. Good morning, he said in that steady, measured voice of his. I think it's time, I told him. There was no need to explain everything. I had kept him updated in fragments over the past year. The subtle shifts. The new advisors. The restructuring language. They've scheduled a meeting, I continued. I expect documentation. He was quiet for a moment. Do you believe they're triggering the clause? He asked. Yes. Another pause. Then we attend prepared. We. That word felt different coming from him. Not romantic. Not nostalgic. Strategic. Over the weekend, I reviewed the divorce settlement again. The clause was clear. Any attempt to significantly reallocate equity without my written consent would automatically activate reversion rights on foundational shares. Foundational shares. The ones established in 1994. The ones linked to my original capital injection. The ones Daniel believed no longer existed. On Sunday evening, Daniel texted. Just so you know, Lila's trying to make this smoother. Don't take things personally. Smoother. I stared at the message. It's interesting how often women are asked not to take things personally when those things involve erasing them. I replied with a single sentence. I'll see you tomorrow. Monday arrived cold and bright. I chose a navy suit I hadn't worn in years. Simple. Structured. Not dramatic. When I walked into the office lobby, the receptionist blinked in surprise. Mrs. Bennett, she said. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't invited, I replied gently. But I'm still relevant. The conference room was already half full. Richard sat at the head of the table. Older now. Thinner. Still confident. Lila sat to his right, tablet open, posture impeccable. Daniel stood near the window, phone in hand. When they saw me, there was a flicker, subtle, but visible. Surprise. Mom, Daniel said, forcing a smile. You made it. I said I would. Richard cleared his throat. We're just reviewing some long-term plans. Nothing adversarial. I took a seat without asking permission. Lila began speaking almost immediately. She used phrases like modernization, future-proofing, clean equity alignment. Her tone was smooth, professional, as if I were an external stakeholder. At one point, she projected a slide outlining proposed changes. Equity redistribution, operational consolidation, asset shielding. Shielding from what? I wondered. Any questions? She asked at the end. I looked at Richard. Are you reallocating foundational shares? I asked calmly. The room went still. Richard frowned slightly. We're optimizing structure. That wasn't my question. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Lila glanced at Richard before answering. The foundational shares are being absorbed into the new umbrella entity. It simplifies things. Absorbed. I folded my hands on the table. And my written consent? I asked. Richard's expression changed. Just slightly. Your consent isn't required anymore, he said carefully. The divorce finalized ownership. I held his gaze. Did you review Section 14.3 of the settlement agreement before drafting this proposal? Silence. Daniel looked confused. Lila's fingers paused over her tablet. Richard blinked. That section refers to stability language, he said slowly. Yes, I replied. It does. I reached into my briefcase and placed a copy of the agreement on the table. Flagged. Highlighted. Thomas entered the room at that exact moment. He had been waiting outside. I believe, he said politely, we should clarify the legal implications before proceeding. Daniel looked between us. What's going on? He asked. I turned to my son. You wanted alignment, I said gently. So let's align with the full document. Lila's confidence shifted. Not gone. Just recalculating. Richard leaned back in his chair, tension visible in his jaw. The meeting they thought would formalize my irrelevance was now something else. A review. A reckoning. Daniel looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time since the steakhouse. Mom, he said quietly, what is this? I met his eyes. Foundation, I answered. And for the first time that week, I saw uncertainty replace conviction. They had assumed I stayed small. They had assumed I didn't understand the structure they were adjusting. They had assumed silence meant surrender. Monday morning proved otherwise. And this was only the beginning. No one spoke for several seconds after Thomas sat down. The air felt different. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply opened his briefcase and placed a second copy of the divorce settlement beside mine. Section 14.3, he said calmly, adjusting his glasses, states that any significant restructuring involving foundational equity requires written consent from Mrs. Bennett. Without that consent, the original shares revert. Daniel frowned. Revert to what? He asked. Thomas looked at him kindly. To her. Silence. Not dramatic silence. The kind that tightens slowly. Richard leaned forward. That clause was symbolic, he said. A formality. Thomas didn't react. It was filed with the court, he replied evenly, and incorporated into the final decree. That makes it enforceable. Lila finally spoke. That interpretation feels aggressive. Interpretation. I folded my hands. It is an interpretation, Thomas said. It's language. He slid a highlighted page across the table. Richard didn't touch it. Daniel did. His eyes moved quickly over the lines. What does reversion of foundational equity actually mean? He asked, voice lower now. Thomas answered without hesitation. It means if you proceed with the proposed umbrella entity without Mrs. Bennett's written approval, the foundational shares established in 1994 automatically return to her direct control. Daniel looked up slowly. How much is that? He asked. Richard didn't answer. Thomas did. 41%. The number didn't echo. It landed. Daniel blinked. That's almost half, he said. Yes. Thomas replied. Lila's composure thinned. That structure was rebalanced during the divorce, she insisted. Operational control shifted. Operational control, Thomas agreed. Not foundational equity. Richard finally reached for the document. His jaw tightened as he read. You knew about this, he said quietly, looking at me. I drafted it, I replied. Daniel turned toward me. You never told me. I met his eyes. You never asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The dynamic in the room had changed. Not loudly, not theatrically, but undeniably. They had walked into that meeting expecting alignment. Instead, they found resistance. Not emotional resistance. Structural resistance. Lila leaned forward. There must be a workaround, she said carefully. We're not trying to exclude you. We're modernizing. I looked at her for the first time since she began speaking. Modernizing doesn't require erasing, I said. She held my gaze, measuring. Richard exhaled slowly. What do you want? He asked. That question used to carry authority. Now it carried uncertainty. I want transparency, I said. And acknowledgement. Daniel looked confused. Acknowledgement of what? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and removed another folder. Inside were copies of the original loan agreements. My signature highlighted. This company, I said calmly, was built on shared risk. I never asked for public credit, but I will not accept private deletion. The words were steady. No tremor. Daniel stared at the documents. I didn't know, he said quietly. No, I replied. You didn't. Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes distant now. You could have said something years ago, he muttered. I didn't need to, I answered. Because back then, we were a family. You don't guard yourself against family. You assume respect. Thomas cleared his throat gently. For clarity, he said, if the proposed restructuring proceeds without Mrs. Bennett's consent, she will hold 41% of the active entity. That changes voting dynamics. Board composition. Executive control. Daniel looked between his father and me. You'd control decisions? He asked. Partially, Thomas confirmed. Lila's fingers tightened around her pen. So what happens now? She asked. I leaned back slightly. Now, I said, we slowed down. No threats. No ultimatums. Just recalibration. Richard studied me. You're doing this because of the lunch, he said quietly. I shook my head. I'm doing this because you assumed I didn't matter. There's a difference. Daniel swallowed. For the first time since that afternoon in the steakhouse, he looked uncertain not about me, but about the story he had believed. Dad, he said carefully, is this accurate? Richard didn't answer right away. Finally, he nodded. Yes. The word was small, but it shifted something. Daniel looked back at me. You were a co-founder? He asked. Yes. Why didn't you ever say that? I held his gaze. Because I didn't need applause to know my value. Silence again. Not tense this time. Reflective. Lila gathered her tablet slowly. We need to review this privately, she said. Thomas nodded. That would be wise. The meeting dissolved without resolution. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just recalculation. As I stood to leave, Daniel reached out lightly. Mom, he said. I paused. I didn't know, he repeated. I know, I said. And I meant it. Outside the office building, the air felt sharper than it had that morning. Cold. Clear. The power shift had begun. They entered that room believing I was obsolete. They left understanding I was embedded. Foundations don't shout. They hold. And now, finally, they realized what was holding them up. The meeting ended without a formal conclusion. No votes. No signatures. Just tension folded neatly into silence. Thomas and I walked out first. I could feel eyes on my back, but no one called my name. Not yet. When the elevator doors closed, Thomas glanced at me. They didn't expect that, he said. No, I replied. They didn't. He studied me for a moment. Are you prepared to enforce the clause if necessary? Yes. There was no hesitation in my voice. Enforcement isn't revenge. It's boundary. Outside, the wind cut sharper than it had that morning. I wrapped my coat tighter and walked toward my car without rushing. Halfway there, I heard footsteps behind me. Mom. Daniel. I turned. He looked unsettled. Not angry. Not defensive. Unsettled. I need to understand, he said. 41%? That's almost controlling interest. Almost, I agreed. Why didn't Dad ever talk about this? You'd have to ask him. He ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture he had as a teenager before exams. Lila said the company needed protection, he continued. From instability. From outdated agreements. Outdated. There it was again. Do I seem unstable to you? I asked calmly. He hesitated. No, do I seem incapable? No, then what? Exactly required protection. He didn't answer. Because the truth was uncomfortable. They weren't protecting the company. They were consolidating influence. I wasn't trying to erase you, Daniel said quietly. I know, I replied. And I did. Daniel wasn't the architect of this shift. He was the beneficiary of a narrative. He had been shown a simplified version of history, one where success belonged to his father, one where Lila symbolized progress, and one where I was background. Mom, he said carefully, if this clause activates, it could destabilize everything. I don't intend to destabilize anything, I said. I intend to be acknowledged. He looked at me differently then, not as someone small, not as someone obsolete, but as someone strategic. Inside the office building, things were less composed. I learned that later. By Wednesday morning, word had spread among senior staff that legal complexities were delaying restructuring. Richard canceled 2 meetings. Lila scheduled 3. Control looks different when it's questioned. That afternoon, Richard called. Not through Daniel. Directly. I didn't think you'd use that clause, he said without greeting. I haven't, I replied. Yet. The silence between us felt older than our divorce. You blindsided us, he continued. I protected myself, I said. He exhaled sharply. Lila believes you're trying to leverage emotion. I smiled faintly. Emotion doesn't file court documents, Richard. Another pause. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. I'm making it accurate. Accuracy can feel like resistance when you've grown used to assumption. That evening, Daniel texted again. Lila wants to meet with you privately. Just the 2 of you. Interesting. She thinks there's room for compromise. Compromise. The word suggested negotiation. Negotiation suggested recognition. I responded, I'm available Friday. 2 days later, Lila walked into my home for the first time. She had never visited before. She looked around subtly, taking in the hardwood floors, the photographs, the framed newspaper clipping from the company's early feature, the one that mentioned Richard by name but showed both of us in the picture. She noticed it. I didn't realize you were listed as co-founder, she said lightly. You didn't ask, I replied. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. No lawyers. No audience. She folded her hands carefully. I want to clear something up, she began. This isn't personal. It became personal when my son called me worthless. I said evenly. Her expression flickered. That wasn't my intention. I didn't say it was. She adjusted her posture. The company needs streamlined leadership, she continued. Investors prefer clarity. I prefer respect, I answered. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, but firm. She studied me for a long moment. You're willing to activate the clause? She asked. If necessary. And if we offer you a buyout? Oh, there it was. They weren't trying to modernize. They were trying to neutralize. I'm not interested in disappearing, I said. She held my gaze. You'd risk fracturing your relationship with Daniel? I didn't flinch. Daniel's relationship with me fractured when he believed I was irrelevant. Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Measured. She realized something in that moment. This wasn't about money. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. When she left, her steps were slower than when she arrived. By the end of the week, the tone inside the company shifted again. No restructuring announcement. No umbrella entity. Just delay. They were recalculating. And for the first time since that lunch, Daniel called me without prompting. Mom, he said quietly, I've been looking at old records. And you were there from the beginning. Yes. Another pause. I didn't know. I know, I said again. But this time, his voice carried something new. Not conviction. Not certainty. Doubt. The kind that grows when a story no longer fits. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought age meant retreat. They thought the foundation had crumbled. Instead, it had been waiting. And now, they were the ones adjusting their expectations. Daniel came over the following Sunday. Not announced. Not scheduled. He stood on my porch holding a thin folder. I found these in Dad's storage cabinet, he said when I opened the door. He didn't smile. He didn't avoid my eyes either. He just looked unsettled. I stepped aside and let him in. The house felt different this time. Not evaluated. Not measured. Just quiet. He placed the folder on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside were old photographs. Warehouse days. Garage days. There was one of Richard and me standing beside the first delivery truck. I was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back, clipboard in hand. Daniel traced the edge of the photo. I don't remember this, he said. You were 9, I replied. You were inside doing homework. He nodded slowly. There are emails too, he added. From the early investors. They CC'd you. Yes. He swallowed. Why didn't Dad ever mention that you negotiated the second round? I poured coffee into 2 mugs before answering. Because he preferred to simplify the story. Daniel looked up. Simplify how? 1 founder is easier to market than 2. He absorbed that quietly. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't defending anyone. He was processing. There's more, he said carefully. I looked at the current restructuring proposal. If the clause activates, you'd hold veto power over major decisions. Yes. Did you plan this all along? The question wasn't accusing. It was searching. No, I said honestly. I planned for respect, not confrontation. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Lila told Dad the clause was outdated, that it wouldn't hold. It holds, I replied. He nodded once. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I think she underestimated you. I didn't smile. Underestimation is not flattering. It's revealing. Inside the company, pressure was building. By midweek, 2 board members had requested clarification about the restructuring delay. Investors don't like uncertainty. Richard was forced to explain that legacy equity language required additional review. Legacy. That word travels quickly. Daniel told me later that Lila was pushing harder than ever. She says if we don't modernize now, we'll lose momentum, he said. And what do you think? I asked. He hesitated. I think I don't understand the full history. That was new. For years, he had been confident in his version of events. Now, there were gaps. And gaps invite questions. Thursday afternoon, Richard called again. His tone was different this time. Less defensive. More tired. You've made your point, he said. I haven't made a point, I replied. I enforced a document. You know what I mean. I didn't respond. He sighed. Daniel's asking questions. He should. Another pause. You could have come to me privately, he said. I did, I answered. Silence. He knew it was true. Years of quiet support. Years of invisible contribution. Years of allowing him to be the face. That was private. This was structural. By Friday, Daniel asked if we could meet for dinner. Just the 2 of us. No Lila. No conference rooms. We chose a small Italian restaurant near my house. Nothing flashy. No polished glass walls. Halfway through the meal, he put down his fork. Mom, he said carefully. I need to ask you something uncomfortable. Go ahead. Did you ever feel like Dad minimized you? The question wasn't easy for him. I could see that. Yes, I said. How long? I took a sip of water before answering. Long enough to learn not to expect credit. He stared at the table. I believed what I saw, he said quietly. He was the one on magazine covers. He was the one giving interviews. Yes. And Lila said you were comfortable letting him lead. I was comfortable building stability. He looked up. That's different. Yes. There it was. Recognition. Not dramatic. Not tearful. But real. He leaned back slowly. I said something I can't take back, he admitted. Yes. I was wrong. The words didn't echo like his insult had. They settled gently. I don't need you to defend me, I said. I need you to understand me. He nodded. I'm starting to. Across town, Richard was facing a different kind of pressure. Investors don't appreciate internal legal tension. Lila had begun reframing the narrative, suggesting the clause was legacy friction that could be negotiated away. Negotiated. That word again. But negotiation requires leverage on both sides. And now they knew I had it. Saturday morning, Daniel called. Dad wants to renegotiate the structure, he said. On what terms? He's willing to formally acknowledge your co-founder status. Publicly. And adjust voting rights. Public acknowledgement. Interesting. It took legal risk to create historical honesty. What do you want, Mom? Daniel asked. The question wasn't strategic this time. It was personal. I want accuracy, I said. And balance. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think Lila expected this, he admitted. No, I replied. She didn't. There was no satisfaction in my voice. Only clarity. Doubt had entered the room. Not just in Daniel's mind, but in Richard's confidence. In Lila's strategy. In the company's future. They thought I was an emotional liability. Instead, I was structural reality. And once reality surfaces, it doesn't disappear quietly. The next meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. This time, I received a formal email invitation. Subject line, Equity Realignment Discussion, Revised Proposal. Revised. That word alone told me everything had shifted. When I entered the conference room, the seating arrangement had changed. Richard no longer sat at the head of the table. The chairs were positioned evenly. No obvious hierarchy. Small details matter. Daniel stood when I walked in. Not automatically. Intentionally. "Morning, Mom," he said. His voice carried something steadier now. Not defensiveness. Not embarrassment. Awareness. Lila remained composed, but there was calculation behind her smile. Thomas sat beside me. Prepared. Richard began. "We've reviewed the clause," he said carefully, "and we acknowledge its enforceability." Acknowledgement. Public. Clear. No qualifiers. Lila opened her tablet and projected a new slide. "This proposal formally recognizes Mrs. Bennett as co-founder," she said. "Effective immediately." There it was. On screen. My name. Not in footnotes. Not in historical appendices. Centered. Daniel glanced at me briefly, then back at the slide. Richard continued. "We're proposing a restructured voting model. 41% remains attributed to foundational equity under your control. However, we suggest a joint governance agreement for major decisions to ensure operational stability." Joint governance. Not absorption. Not erasure. Balance. I didn't respond immediately. Thomas scanned the printed copies. "What about board composition?" he asked. "2 seats allocated to foundational equity," Lila replied. "That meant 2 seats chosen by me." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. "An executive authority?" Thomas continued. "Shared oversight for major acquisitions, mergers, or equity transfers," Richard answered. The tone in the room was different from the previous meeting. Less assumption. More negotiation. Daniel finally spoke. "I think transparency moving forward is important," he said. His eyes didn't avoid mine. I didn't understand the full picture before. Richard looked at him. A flicker of something passed between them. Realization, perhaps. Daniel was no longer echoing. He was evaluating. I placed my hands flat on the table. "I have no interest in destabilizing the company," I said calmly. "I also have no interest in disappearing from its structure." No emotion. Just fact. Lila nodded slowly. "This framework allows visibility without disruption," she said. Visibility. That word carried weight. For years, I chose invisibility. Now they were offering visibility as concession. I turned to Daniel. "Why now?" I asked gently. He held my gaze. "Because I saw the early documents," he said. "And I asked Dad questions." Richard didn't interrupt. That told me more than words would have. Thomas closed the folder. "This proposal avoids automatic reversion," he said. "But only if Mrs. Bennett signs consent acknowledging the new structure." There it was. Consent. The same word they overlooked before. The power shift was no longer theoretical. It was procedural. Richard leaned forward slightly. "I'm not trying to push you out," he said quietly. I studied his face. Age had settled into it. Regret, maybe. Or simply awareness. "I know," I said. And I did. This wasn't about exile. It was about narrative control. For years, the narrative excluded me because I allowed it to. Now, it required my signature to move forward. Lila clasped her hands. "We'd like this resolved quickly," she said. "The market responds poorly to uncertainty." Markets, investors, momentum, all valid concerns. But none outweighed structural respect. Daniel cleared his throat. "I think we should take the week," he said. "Review everything carefully." That was new. He wasn't rushing alignment anymore. He was advocating deliberation. Richard looked at him, then at me. "Agreed," he said finally. No one rushed me for an answer. No one implied obstruction. No one minimized the clause. The room had changed. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I threatened litigation. But because they now understood something simple. The foundation was not symbolic. It was active. As we stood to leave, Daniel walked beside me toward the elevator. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For believing a simplified version of you." I didn't smile. But I nodded. "Complexity isn't a flaw," I said. "It's depth." He exhaled slowly. "I called you worthless," he added. "Yes. I was wrong. I know." This time, the words felt different. Not defensive. Not corrective. Healing, perhaps. Outside the building, the sky was clear. Cold, but bright. The power shift was complete. They entered this process believing I was an obstacle. They now understood I was infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't beg for relevance. It requires recognition. The decision wasn't finalized yet. Signatures still mattered. But something more important had already changed. Daniel no longer stood on one side of the table. He stood between. And that space, that middle ground, was where balance begins. I didn't sign the documents immediately. I took them home, laid them out on my dining table, the same oak table Richard and I bought during our 3rd year of marriage. The same one Daniel used to do homework on while I calculated inventory costs beside him. Paper has weight. Not physically. Emotionally. Thomas called Thursday morning. Everything checks out structurally, he said. The revised governance model protects your 41% and formalizes co-founder recognition. Any hidden risks? I asked. No, he replied. But once you sign, you're choosing partnership instead of leverage. That sentence stayed with me. Partnership instead of leverage. Leverage had power. Partnership had balance. Friday afternoon, Daniel came by again. He didn't bring folders this time. Just himself. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The documents lay between us. You're going to decide today? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly. I need to say something before you do. I waited. When I called you worthless, he said, voice steady but low. I was repeating something I didn't even realize I believed. I didn't interrupt. I thought value meant visibility, he continued. Dad was visible. Lila is visible. You were steady. Quiet. I confused quiet with small. I folded my hands. Quiet is not small, I said. I know that now. The room felt still. Not tense. Just honest. I don't want you signing because you feel pressured, he added. And I don't want you refusing because you're trying to prove something. That's fair, I said. He looked at the papers. If you don't sign, the clause activates. You take back control. Things get messy. Yes. And if you do sign, you're choosing to stay connected. Yes. He exhaled slowly. I don't deserve that choice from you, he admitted. That was the first time his voice carried humility instead of analysis. This isn't about what you deserve, I said gently. It's about what I value. He looked at me carefully. And what do you value? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the kitchen. At the cabinets I refinished myself. At the window where Daniel once stood waiting for his father to come home from late meetings. At the table where I signed the first business loan 3 decades ago. I value structure, I said finally. And I value relationship. In that order. He nodded slowly. I don't want to lose you, he said. You almost did, I replied. The truth doesn't need volume. Just clarity. Later that afternoon, I drove to the office alone. No announcement. No meeting scheduled. Richard was in his office when I arrived. He stood when I walked in. For a moment, we looked at each other without speaking. Years compressed into silence. You've always been steadier than me, he said quietly. I had to be. I replied. He nodded once. I should have acknowledged you publicly years ago. Yes, I said. No accusation. Just agreement. He gestured toward the conference table in his office. The revised documents were already there. I don't want this company built on erasure, he said. That's good, I answered. Because it wasn't built that way. I sat down. He remained standing for a moment before taking the seat across from me. No lawyers. No Lila. Just the two of us. Are you signing? He asked. Yes. He looked surprised. Why? Because leverage proves power. But partnership proves maturity. Because I don't need to win, I said calmly. I need to be recognized. He absorbed that. I picked up the pen. There was no dramatic pause. No trembling hand. Just ink on paper. My name signed beneath formal acknowledgement. Co-founder. 41% retained. Joint governance established. Visibility restored. When I finished, I placed the pen down carefully. Richard exhaled. Thank you, he said. This isn't a favor, I replied. It's alignment. As I left the building, Daniel was waiting near the entrance. He must have known I was coming. He searched my face for an answer. I signed, I said. Relief washed over him. But there was something else there too. Respect. Not automatic. Earned. I won't forget this, he said. Don't, I replied. We stood there for a moment in the cool afternoon air. No dramatic embrace. No tears. Just presence. A week ago, he called me worthless in a crowded restaurant. Today, my name was formally written into the foundation of the company he believed I had nothing to do with. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, it chooses not to crush, but to correct. The signature wasn't surrender. It was confirmation. I was never small. I was structural. And now, finally, everyone in that room knew it. The announcement went out the following Monday. Not dramatic. Not celebratory. Just a formal internal memo. We are pleased to formally recognize Margaret Bennett as co-founder and board member, effective immediately. Margaret. Not Mrs. Bennett. Not former spouse. Co-founder. The language was clean. Accurate. Long overdue. The first board meeting under the new structure felt different. Not tense. Structured. There's a difference. I took my seat without ceremony. Two board members I hadn't seen in years nodded respectfully. One even said, "It's good to have historical continuity." Represented. Historical continuity. Interesting way to describe 30 years of labor. But I accepted it. Lila presented quarterly projections with the same confidence she always had. But her tone shifted slightly. She no longer spoke as if she were the sole architect of direction. She said things like, "In collaboration with foundational leadership, foundational leadership." Language adapts when power balances. Daniel sat between Richard and me during that meeting. Not physically in the middle by accident. Intentionally. When acquisition proposals came up, he looked at me before voting. Not for permission. For perspective. That was new. Weeks earlier, he had spoken with certainty. Now he asked questions. What was our debt ratio during early expansion? How did we handle supplier instability in the 90s? He was no longer chasing momentum. He was studying resilience. After one meeting, he walked out with me instead of his father. I didn't realize how much context I was missing, he admitted. Context is expensive, I replied. It costs time. He nodded. I want to learn it. That mattered more than the apology. Inside the company, subtle shifts continued. Senior staff began emailing me directly. Not out of obligation. Out of recognition. One manager asked about early vendor relationships. Another requested my input on workforce retention strategies. Apparently, stability was back in style. Lila adapted. To her credit, she didn't resist openly. She recalibrated. In private, during a board lunch, she said to me, "You have long-term patience. That's valuable." I looked at her calmly. Patience only works when people mistake it for weakness, I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. We weren't allies, but we were aligned. There's a difference. Richard changed too. Not dramatically, but visibly. He began referencing our early years during investor calls. Not my garage days. Not my first loan. Our language reveals ego. It also reveals correction. One afternoon, he stopped by my office after a board session. "I underestimated how much structural weight you carried," he said. "Yes," I replied. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply acknowledged. That was enough. At home, Daniel's tone softened. Not out of guilt. Out of recalibration. He began calling midweek again. Sometimes just to ask, "How did you approach scaling without losing control?" Other times just to say, "Dinner Sunday?" The word mom returned naturally. Not forced. Not strategic. Just familiar. One evening, as we cleared dishes, he paused. "I keep thinking about that lunch," he said quietly. "So do I replied. He swallowed. I was trying to impress Dad. I know. I thought choosing his side meant strength. And now, he looked at me directly. Now I think strength is understanding both sides. Growth doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives in pauses like that. The company stabilized under the revised structure. Investors appreciated clarity. Governance meetings became measured instead of rushed. No umbrella entity. No absorption of foundational shares. Just balanced expansion. And something else happened. Word spread quietly within our professional circle that the company had a co-founder previously unrecognized. Journalists began digging. One trade magazine reached out for a feature on hidden founders. I agreed to a short interview. Not to rewrite history, just to document it accurately. When the article published, Daniel sent it to me with a simple message. "I'm proud of you. Not proud of what I recovered. Proud of who I was." That difference matters. A month after the signature, we returned to the same steakhouse. Daniel suggested it. We sat at a similar corner table. Same polished glasses. Same hum of conversation. This time, no one raised their voice. No comparisons. No erasure. Halfway through the meal, Daniel looked at me. "I don't ever want to speak to you the way I did," he said. "Then don't," I replied. "Forgiveness isn't loud. It's behavioral." He nodded. And that was enough. A week ago, he thought value meant visibility. Now he understood value meant foundation. The signature changed governance. But it did something else too. It corrected a narrative. Not just inside a company. Inside a family. I didn't win. I didn't crush anyone. I didn't activate the clause and take control. I chose alignment over dominance. But make no mistake, I could have done otherwise. And everyone in that room knows it. It has been 3 months since that lunch. 3 months since my son looked across a white tablecloth and said, "You're worthless." The word doesn't echo anymore. It doesn't sting. It instructs. Life didn't explode after the board restructuring. There were no dramatic headlines. No lawsuits. No public spectacle. Just quiet correction. The company adjusted to shared governance. Meetings became slower but smarter. Decisions required discussion instead of assumption. Richard consults instead of declaring. Lila strategizes instead of steering alone. Daniel listens before he speaks. It's remarkable what clarity does. One evening, Daniel came over with a cardboard box. "Found these in the warehouse archive," he said. Inside were old blueprints, early product drafts, supplier contracts, all stamped with dates from the 90s. And my handwriting. Notes in the margins. Budget calculations. Questions about sustainability. He spread them across my dining table the way I once spread bills across it. "I used to think success started when the numbers got big," he said quietly. I ran my fingers across the faded ink. "Success starts when someone risks losing everything," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I didn't see your risk," he admitted. "That's because I never displayed it," I said. There's a strange thing about stability. When you do it well, no one notices. The lights stay on. The mortgage gets paid. The business survives downturns. And people assume it was inevitable. It wasn't. Nothing stable is inevitable. Richard called me last week. Not about governance. Not about contracts. He asked if I'd join him at a small industry event. As co-founder. Publicly. I agreed. Not because I needed recognition, but because acknowledgement matters, not just for me, but for accuracy. At the event, when someone asked how the company survived its early years, Richard gestured toward me. "She held it together," he said. Simple. Direct. True. I didn't need applause. Just truth. Later that night, Daniel walked me to my car. "Mom," he said, stopping beside the driver's door. "Yes." I keep thinking about that sentence I said. "I know." He shook his head slightly. "I don't recognize the version of myself who said it." "That's good," I replied. He looked confused. "Why?" "Because it means you've outgrown him. Growth is uncomfortable. It requires admitting you were wrong. Not strategically wrong. Morally wrong." He swallowed. "I thought worth was measured by momentum," he said. "By visibility. By who looked powerful. And now?" I asked. He looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as a retired mother. Not as background. As infrastructure. "Now I think worth is measured by what holds when everything else shifts." I didn't answer. I just nodded. Because that was enough. A week later, I drove past the steakhouse again. Traffic moved the same way it had that afternoon. The building looked identical. If you had been sitting at that corner table 3 months ago, you would have thought you were watching a woman shrink. A son choosing sides. A younger woman smiling politely while history was erased. But you would have been wrong. I didn't shrink. I recalibrated. There's a difference. Worthless things don't secure loans. Worthless things don't sign incorporation papers. Worthless things don't hold 41% of a company together when ambition outruns memory. Worthless things don't steady families when ego shifts direction. Silence is often misread. Especially in women my age. People mistake it for weakness. For irrelevance. For resignation. It isn't. Sometimes silence is assessment. Sometimes silence is restraint. And sometimes silence is the space you allow others to reveal themselves. That lunch didn't destroy my relationship with my son. It exposed it. Exposure is uncomfortable. But it's also clarifying. Daniel doesn't speak over me now. He asks. He listens. He corrects himself. Not because I punished him. Because he saw what he had overlooked. And that lesson will stay with him longer than any legal clause ever could. As for Lila, she's still ambitious. Still polished. But she no longer mistakes history for decoration. She understands now that foundations are not decorative elements. They are load-bearing. And you don't remove load-bearing structures without consequences. I didn't activate the clause. I didn't take control. I didn't need to. Power doesn't always have to be exercised to be real. Sometimes it only needs to be visible. 3 months ago, my son believed I was worthless. Today, my name is written into every major decision the company makes. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Structurally. And if there's one thing I've learned at 67, it's this. You don't argue your value. You demonstrate it. Quietly. Consistently. Until even the people who doubted you can't ignore it. He said I was worthless. I stayed silent. And a week later, everything changed. Not because I shouted, but because I remembered exactly who I was. And I refused to let anyone simplify me again.